Maybe you're in a cabin, maybe you're hiking along a trail, but alone in the woods is a state you may not want to find yourself. Sure, the fresh air and serenity make it seem worth it, but when the claws begin to scrape at the dirt on the edge of your vision, and the figures begin to move between the trees, you might begin to feel just as alone as you really are. Enjoy these alone in the woods scary stories, and be sure to send me your stories at darkstories.org. As you can tell, I'm in the mood for lonely stories. So if you have a story about camping alone, hiking alone, and being home alone, I'd love to hear them. Also, check out eeriecast.com for more creepy podcasts like this. Now, let's begin. I still don't know. From Running 8.3. This took place in the middle of farm country in New York. Most people hear New York and immediately think NYC. Not even close. There's a huge state above New York City, full of woods, farms, and tiny towns. It's actually very beautiful, just very expensive to live here. And with no jobs in those small towns, you can only guess the poverty levels. Anyway, I'm getting off track. I'm a lover of all things spooky, but I am a skeptic, or I was. I'm still on the fence. The night in question was a very warm, humid night. The sky was slightly cloud-covered, and the fire I'd made was flickering nicely. This was the first time I'd had any time to myself in a few months, as I'm a mom of 3 awesome kids who are now all grown. I lived in town and had neighbors on either side of me and out back of me. But there were some small trees and brush separating the back and fences on either side of us. I was sitting by myself drinking a few beers and definitely had a buzz going on, but I was aware of my surroundings still. I heard a weird noise coming from the side of one of the neighbors' yards, and I figured it was my neighbor just checking in on me. I sat there waiting to hear his voice. It was around 1 a.m., and it wasn't unusual for him to be awake. I waited for a moment and heard nothing, so I figured it was just the beer talking. I decided that was probably enough, and I should let the fire die out and go inside. The moment I stood up, I heard a low growl. What in the world? I thought. All my dogs were inside, and the neighbors didn't have dogs anymore, as they had to put their dog down a week earlier. I called out to my dogs, and all 3 showed up at the glass door inside, so it couldn't have been them. Then it grew louder, an aggressive growl, a warning. My eyes darted around to find nothing. I grew up around wildlife, and regardless of what people will tell you, there are wolves in New York. So that did cross my mind. Maybe that or a coyote. They can be pretty common in the area. Also black bears, but no way that noise was a bear. I grabbed the flashlight, and I heard the growl once more. Only this time it sounded like it said, "Don't." By then, I'm a little scared, but then I think it's just my imagination, and I need to go inside. I grabbed the bucket of water and dumped it around the fire, then onto it. That's when I spotted it. A large figure standing at the fence, a very large figure. I almost threw up from fear and from the smell. There was an aroma coming from it, like rotten garbage. I was terrified, but acted like I hadn't seen it. Whatever it was had to have been at least 7 feet tall, and it looked to have fur covering its body. Its growl was so menacing. I walked towards my house, and I could hear it following me. I got inside, locking the doors and grabbing a knife. My dogs were now sniffing vigorously and growling themselves. They love everyone and are never aggressive, so this was odd behavior. My doorknob on my door started to rattle, and my dogs went crazy. I yelled and ran for the living room. Heart of a lion, I have. That was the last thing I heard that night, so the dogs must have scared whoever or whatever it was away. Still, I stayed up the rest of the night. I finally did fall asleep at daylight. I have no idea if it was someone messing with me or something else. But I never did do the alone around a fire thing ever again while I lived there. The Gray Man That Visits Me, from Leia, 27. I'm a 20-year-old girl who grew up in a cult. 90% of my family belonged to that cult. As a result, I was very sheltered and supervised constantly. Though I wasn't completely convinced of the teachings, I didn't exactly have anywhere to go if I wanted to leave. So I got baptized in 2019. The week after my baptism was the first time he visited. I was asleep on a hot summer night, the breeze cooling my feet at the foot of my bed. I slept with my windows slightly open and the screens closed to keep out bugs. The room was dark except for the minimal light from the street outside the room. Suddenly, I'm jerked awake as I feel something heavy pounce on my chest. My eyes shot open, but I saw nothing. I tried to get up, but I was being pushed down into the mattress. All at once, the pressure was lifted from me, and I sat up, parallel to my window. And there he was. A slender figure, gray in color, sitting with its legs tucked into its chest outside my window. The thing's head snapped towards me, and I saw its face for the first time. His head looked as though it was a skull, thinly draped in gray, leathery skin. He was completely bald, with sunken black holes for eye sockets, his eyes being bloodshot and pupilless. Suddenly, I drew in a breath and stood to run, but I was tackled to the ground by some force while paintings flew off the walls of my room towards me. I attempted to crawl towards the door when my hamster cage was thrown from my desk onto my head, and all the writing utensils on my desk were shot towards me. I screamed so hard and loud, soon my family busted open my locked door to find me there. I was curled into a ball, crying in the middle of my room when they flicked on the light. My dad immediately started yelling at me to be quiet and just tell him what happened. I opened my eyes and my room was completely intact. The only thing on the floor was a painting I'd done a month prior, directly in front of me. The painting was of a creature that I hadn't stopped seeing in my dreams until I drew it. It was the Gray Man. I bolted from the room and collapsed on the floor in front of my siblings. I barely had a voice after screaming like I had, so through a hoarse voice, I relayed the series of events that had just occurred. My parents, being super religious, immediately began to come up with BS explanations to dismiss what I'd seen. I recently told my parents I was depressed, and under the advice of my maternal grandparents, my parents began to believe I was depressed because I was lacking in faith and didn't trust in divine power enough. There was no evidence of my room being trashed or the Gray Man at my window, just the painting in the middle of the floor. My dad walked around my room slowly, and he picked up the painting. He spent some time contemplating the painting in his hand and the paintings on my walls, all done by me as I was an art student. He walked out to the hallway and stood in front of me with the painting in hand. He handed me the painting as my siblings and mother looked down at it. "You have attracted a demon," my dad said. I stared at him blankly as confusion covered my siblings' faces. My mind raced with the possibility of how I could have done this. The things you draw, the things you paint, the stories you write, you say you're expressing your feelings, but in doing this, you're inviting these negative spirits. He took on a preaching tone as he said this. "It's true. We looked at your history and what you've been watching and the books you've been reading. It's all horror and crime, so much violence." My mom butted in. "You know what you have to do," my dad told me as he dismissed everyone back to their rooms. I started to walk back into my room as the lights in the house turned off one by one. Then I heard my older sister at the bottom of the steps say, "I believe you." I motioned for her to follow me into my room, and she did. We sat on my bed, discussing what I'd seen. The following day, I called the elders of my congregation and explained to them the events of the past night. They told me to collect all the paintings of the creature I'd ever done, and all the books and movies in my room that might provoke evil spirits. They told me next to build a bonfire and burn the pile of devil propaganda and pray over it. I did just as they said, through the tears and pain of losing my beloved paintings and books. Fast forward to the end of 2020. I'd graduated high school, and I started college to become a veterinary assistant. Alongside school, I worked at an animal rescue shelter, right in the middle of the woods on the countryside of town. My boss at the rescue was a part of the same cult as my parents. Her husband was very close with my dad. They were both higher-ups in the congregation. I was alone most of the time I worked at the rescue, walking animals on paths through the woods by myself, spending most of my day in the yard bordering the thick woods. I saw the gray man frequently at sunset, out in the woods, just watching. He'd follow my movements as I locked up the rescue and drove down the winding dirt road to get back to the main road. On the final occasion I saw him, I was alone in the outdoor kennels on a very overcast day. I was in the kennels collecting dog toys in preparation of scrubbing the kennels when I felt the pressure of someone hugging me from behind. I looked up, glancing over my shoulder. No one was there. The force let me go, and I spun around. None of the animals were anywhere to be seen either. Thunder cracked loudly, and my hair was suddenly yanked down. I dropped onto my back. I began screaming as I felt the force of someone kicking and punching my torso. The sky broke with huge raindrops as the yard erupted with barks and yelps from the animals. My boss pulled up into the yard and jumped out of her car, running over to me. She lifted me up, freaking out as I screamed to her that I had been attacked. She told me there was no one here and that I sounded crazy. The next day was my day off. When I woke up, I was sore and my body felt so heavy. I stepped in front of the mirror and I lifted my shirt. My back and chest were covered in bruises and small cuts. I showed no one for fear they'd do something extreme to expel the spirit from my life. My boss's husband had heard about the encounter in my room from my dad, and of course my boss told him what had happened with me at the rescue. He advised my dad to keep a closer eye on me and to monitor everything I partook in. He did just that. This went on for a year until I got a job at a beauty shop down the street. At the shop, I finally met people who weren't in my cult. They introduced me to new ways of thinking and new aspects of life. Fast forward to 2022, I've left the cult and now practice witchcraft as I'm becoming more in tune with my inner spirit and life path. I have no contact with anyone from the cult, and they have no idea where I reside or work anymore. I have not seen the gray man since that day at the rescue, but lately I've been increasingly paranoid at night, for no apparent reason. I've cleansed my energy and my home, but I'm anxious anytime I leave the house. I've been waking up to the window unlocked, even though I routinely lock all windows and doors before lying down each night. I'm afraid he has not forgotten me. This is why I hate Halloween. From I Love My Dog 567. No one believes that I saw whatever this thing was. It took place on Halloween. I was 11, almost 12, and in my neighborhood, we celebrate every holiday. I lived in a secluded area of southern Georgia, full of thick weeds, trees, brush, and all that stuff. We were doing a trunk or treat since all the houses were spaced out. It'd be too far to walk from house to get candy, so we all thought it would be easier to do the trunk or treat. The night went smoothly, and my friend's mom, who we'll call B, was dressing up as Ghostface. So when we saw B hiding in the brush, it wasn't a surprise. I guess all of us kids like the idea of being scared. I've always been a fan of horror myself. I do believe in the supernatural. Now, on that night, it was getting darker out, and my one neighbor and I, let's call them Jay, wanted to go find B. So we gathered all of our friends and my brother and his friends to go look for B. Now, being a kid, I was torn on who to go with. I mean, my friends or my own blood. But they went on without me as I was undecided, leaving me under a streetlight in front of my house. I started to walk the way my friends had gone. Keep in mind the woods were on the left side of me, and our streetlight bulb was dying out, so I pulled out my phone and turned on the light. I remember I was walking and getting a little nervous, being alone. It was around then I heard a branch snap. I did what anyone would do. I shone my flashlight towards the sound, expecting a squirrel or something like it. At first, I didn't see anything. I should have kept going, but instead I was too curious. I looked around some more. That was a mistake. Sitting in the brush, not even trying to hide, was a pitch-black figure. It looked like it had copied B's outfit with the scream mask, but when it stood up, it was way taller than B. I stood there staring at it in shock. The way people say time slowed down when they experienced something traumatic, that's how it was for me. Everything seemed to slow down. That's when it hit me. It was saying something under its breath, and it sounded like B, but not right. I could only make out one word. Run. Before I could even think it, I was running, and I was screaming, and I had soiled myself. I ran to my brother because I didn't want to go past that thing. When I got to my brother in a heavy panic, I saw B there. How'd you get here before me? I remember screeching at her. I was with them the whole time, Leah. At that moment, I realized that wasn't B back there. She couldn't have beaten me through the Georgia thick brush. My brother took me back to my parents, and that's where I stayed for a while, jumping at every sound. That night I told my neighbor Jay about the story, and she believed me. I spent the night at Jay's house. Jay's place was 2 stories high, and her bed was underneath the window. Her window had no blinds or curtains, so you could just see out or in. It was about 10 at night. We were watching a movie and getting sugar high. At a certain moment, I was opening up some candy, and I heard a tap coming from the window. Not just 1, but 4 or 5. Jay asked if I was doing that, and to stop. But I replied, no, it wasn't me. I was cut off by what sounded like me screaming from earlier. But again, it was wrong, like when that thing mimicked B's voice. It sounded kind of like me, but it was on repeat. At this point, I knew what it was. I didn't dare to turn around. I started throwing up from fear, and Jay began to cry. Sometime later, it left. The encounters that night made me hate Halloween. I don't know what it was. Maybe a skinwalker, but I can't be sure. Jay and I have been closer friends than ever, and we both can't sleep without some type of light on in the house. We were never scared of the dark before this. If anyone knows what this is, leave us a comment, and thank you for hearing my story to the end. It feels good to tell others about it. Death and the Hat Man, from Moni B Good. I'm a girl in my 50s. This is a true story of events that took place over a decade ago. It was a cold winter night. I was with my fiancé at his home that rested in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in Pennsylvania. The wind was wicked, and the snow was blowing sideways. It was building up to be quite a night, and as the lights flickered here and there, we both knew we needed to settle in for the evening. Before we could, though, he needed to run to the store for a few necessities: cigarettes, drinks, and snacks. We mostly hung out at my place, so his home was scantily stocked. I didn't feel like going back out, so alone, I curled up on the corner of his couch by a lamp and opened up a book, which I'd started to read earlier that week. Now, when he had left, and no sooner pulled out of the driveway, the lights had begun to flicker. Geez, I thought, I really didn't want to be there alone if his lights went out for good. This place was not as comfortable as my own home, and at times it gave me an eerie vibe. I turned my attention to my book, telling myself that it wouldn't be too long. The store is only 1 mile away. But when they flickered for about 5 seconds again, I decided I wanted to go to his room instead. There I could nestle under his thick bed comforter, and if the power went out, I could just cover up my head and wait it out. My fiancé, Doug, liked to hang a sheet between his bedroom and living room in the winter months, simply to keep more heat in his bedroom. I got up from the couch, turned off the lamp, and approached the doorway to his room. I then reached my hand around the sheet and flipped on his bedroom light. Then, standing before me, just inches from me on the sheet, was the distinct shadow of a tall man in a flat-brimmed hat. I froze. In the seconds before I regained myself, I noticed no features except his hat, and that he was possibly wearing a long coat of some sort. "Move," my mind screamed, and I finally reacted, flipping his bedroom light switch back off. I backed up in amazement and could not believe what I just saw. I stood there a minute, just gathering my composure. With a bit of courage from who knows where, I flipped the switch again. He was gone. I decided then to move back to the couch and wait for Doug there. When he arrived, I told him what I saw. He said my face was drained of all color, and my eyes were wider than he'd ever seen. It was obvious something terrified me, so he believed me. Needless to say, I spent less time at his place from that point on. I'm really not sure exactly how much time went by, but it was now nearly spring and I was home, sleeping soundly in my bed. My phone rang at around 6 a.m. Sleepily, I answered to the frantic voice of Doug's neighbor, Jeff, yelling into my ear. He explained to me that Doug's house was on fire and that Doug needed to get home now. I quickly turned towards the side of the bed where Doug slept, only to see an empty space, and remembered that Doug had gone home last night. I shouted to Jeff that Doug was home, that he needed to check on him ASAP. He needed to get him out of that house. We hung up as he agreed to call me as soon as he got Doug out of the house. His plan was to break his bedroom window, assuming Doug was in his bed. I threw on my shoes and jumped in my car, still in my pajamas. It was a 15-minute drive to his house, and I gotta tell ya, it was the longest 15-minute drive of my life. My phone wasn't ringing as I anticipated a call back from Jeff telling me that Doug was safely out of the house. 5 minutes into the drive, I'm now speeding down the highway when I hear the city fire whistles going off, and still no calls from the neighbor. As I turned onto the top of his long, windy road, I could see the flashing lights where his house was. My mind knew the truth, but my heart would not accept it yet. "No, no, no," I screamed. I approached a fire truck, threw my car in park, and ran to the closest fire person I could reach, yelling, "Please tell me you got him out of there." She asked me who I was, and I responded his fiancée. She put her head down and shook it left to right, clearly meaning no. My knees collapsed, and before I hit the ground, Jeff caught me. It was a couple of hours before the fire was safely out, and the fire personnel could enter the home. As they opened the front door, I looked in. There on the floor, lying in the doorway between his bedroom and living room, was Doug. The fire never reached him. He had passed away instead due to smoke inhalation. I then realized where he lay was the exact spot that I saw the Hat Man just a couple of months ago. Did the Hat Man come to warn me of Doug's impending death? Did he cause Doug's death by appearing in the exact same spot Doug died in? I don't know much about the Hat Man, other than he is seen all over the world. But my question is why? Does anyone have any information they can give on him? I know my Doug is in a better place now, but I miss him terribly, and I have so many unanswered questions. The Thing in the Woods. From Anonymous. I'm a high school student that lives in between a medium-sized city and a rural country town in western North Carolina. This happened one year on Halloween. I just can't take it off my mind no matter what I do. What I heard and felt in those woods just wasn't normal. It was about 6 p.m. that night. I just got out of the shower after I got home from football practice. I was getting ready to go to my first ever party at a friend's house. I got dressed and was going as the, I had to do it to him guy, because it was easy to do. I went into the garage and opened the garage door to get the leash for my dog Jack, so he could come with me. For some reason, my stepdad let Jack out of the house without a leash because he thought he would listen. Jack is a mix of a greyhound and yellow lab, so he likes to sniff around and chase animals. So letting him off the leash was a bad idea. So Jack bolted out of the door and out of the house. I ran after him because we live by a road where people tend not to follow the speed limit. I chased him around for about 10 minutes until he came to the entrance of these woods that are at the end of my street. He and I saw a deer run out of one side of the woods, and my dog bolted after him. I got flustered and went in after him. This was a really bad idea on my part. A little something about these woods. On 2 sides it borders a highway, and on the other 2 sides just houses. It has an area of maybe 20 miles, which is just an estimate on my part. I spent the next 30 minutes wandering the woods on my own with a weird feeling that I can't really describe. At one point I thought I heard a noise down this small path. I went down the path because I thought the noise could have come from my dog. Or maybe I was just hopeful it was from him. I went that way for about 5 minutes, while this feeling I had got weirder and weirder. I then came to a clearing in the woods after walking over a small hill. The ground was covered in these tall, grass-like plants that were maybe 3 feet tall at most. As I moved through the area, I suddenly froze. Half my mind wanted me to proceed and find my dog, but the other half begged me to turn around and leave, because something just wasn't right out here. I stood there for a few seconds before I realized that all the sounds around me had gone. It was complete silence. No crickets, birds, or animals, only the distant sound of cars on the highway. This was strange, as just earlier as I was walking around, I'd heard noises everywhere else. Suddenly, there was a new noise. In front of me, I heard the sound of branches cracking and leaves being crushed. Whatever was coming through, it was big. The sound I made when walking in the woods was pretty loud because I'm a big guy, but this noise sounded way louder than the noise I could make. It kept getting closer and closer to me until I finally decided to turn around and walk the other way. My brain was trying to rationalize what this was, but nothing really made sense. Coyotes that live in the area wouldn't be out for a while and wouldn't make that much noise. It wasn't a deer since it would be moving much faster, and I would have probably heard my dog's collar as well. After all, he would be hot on its tail. Bears don't live around here, only in the areas to the south of where I live. I also rolled out the idea of someone living in these woods. There may be people in the area that do that, but no person that was living out in the woods could weigh that much and would have probably said something to me by now, so as to avoid startling me. I kept walking, and I heard the sound of the steps starting to get faster. Then I began to sprint, booking it down the hill, just running through branches and briars in a straight line. I didn't care to turn around to see what it was chasing me, because whatever it was, I didn't feel like seeing it. I thought that would make me panic even worse. After about 3 minutes, I saw the opening in the woods again. This creature was still hot on my tail, and I was starting to get really tired. I ran through the opening and kept going past one of the houses. Then I heard it. This ungodly roar. It came from behind me, from that thing that pursued me. I'd never heard anything like it before. It didn't sound like any animal that I knew. I can't even imitate the noise myself, no matter how hard I try. My blood ran cold, and I felt the biggest adrenaline boost of my life. I ran back to my house in record time, and I ran inside. I called my parents back to the house since they were in the car searching for my dog. We gave up the search for the time being, and I was still pretty shook up from what just happened. I left for the party when my parents got to the house, because I wanted to leave the area, at least for a while. My stepdad did decide to stay home despite my warnings because he wanted to be there if the dog came back. And thankfully the dog did come back, safe if not a little bit shaken. I'm still troubled by this because I don't know what chased me. I'm never going to step foot near those woods again. This makes me quite glad I'm going to college so I can get away from whatever that was. Fair warning to anyone visiting the country area to the west of Asheville, North Carolina. Don't go into the woods alone or unarmed.
That brings us to the end of this episode of Darkness Prevails. More terrifying stories are on the way soon, so subscribe and smash that like button. By the way, did you know this show is available as a podcast called Unexplained Encounters? Just search for, follow, and rate Unexplained Encounters on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. This show is part of the EerieCast network. Go to EerieCast.com for more scary podcasts, such as Freaky Folklore, which explores your favorite monsters, myths, and mysteries, as well as Redwood Bureau, a fictional horror podcast about an agent on the run from an evil secret organization that captures supernatural creatures and entities. Well, thanks for tuning in. Stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.